So I think that you will have received in some of the information we sent you in advance, unless you're one of the people who've been to quite a few of these sessions. You will have found out about the evaluation principles, which are a really important resource for the centre. Their origins come from our original consultation with the sector. So shortly after we won the bid for the Centre for Cultural Value, we did quite a lot of talking to academics, policymakers, and most importantly, for this part of our work, to people working in the sector. And to our surprise, in some ways, the thing that people particularly wanted, I think particularly sector participants were interested in, was help with evaluation. And although we were a bit wary of creating a kind of toolkit, one size all fits, this is how to do evaluation, because clearly context is everything, we felt that what might be very useful would be a set of principles, which in a sense gave us some coordinates to steer by, rather than a sort of a straitjacket of here's how to do ABC of evaluation, which clearly is more complicated than that. So to lead us into that process, Dr. Beatrice Garcia, who's one of the associates of the centre, did some research around evaluation principles. They exist in lots of different industries. And we were really asking ourselves the question, I suppose, do we need something specific to the cultural sector, or could we pick up things from elsewhere? And it felt as though the answer to this was definitely yes. So, for example, the NHS have a series of evaluation principles, but they're very prescriptive and rather narrow, to do with health outcomes. The UN tool, the United Nations tool, is particularly political. So we felt that we really did need something for our sector that took into account the need to capture sort of complex, interwoven layers of creative learning and social value. So hence we have the principles. And I should say at this third one that we also, I think we announced the principles last November, in November 2021. And we said after a year we'd review whether they were the right ones, and we might update them. So when you're having a look at those, do please feel free, either in the feedback or here today, just to say, it's made me think, I wonder if we should have something in there about this or that. We're very interested to know whether we think there's anything that dynamically we should be changing about the principles. They should be a living tool, if you like. So in order to come up with the principles, I should explain that we came up with a co-design process involving some 40 plus practitioners, academics, practitioners, specialist evaluators. And I'm really delighted to see that some of them are here today. So I can see some of them joining us. So, please feel free to keep us on the straight and narrow and share some of the thoughts from that process if it seems relevant. But in the end, it was quite a drawn out, really fascinating process, as you can imagine. And we came up with 12 principles specific to the cultural sector and grouped under 4 headings of being beneficial. So that's about purpose and use. Robust, about rigor and method. People-centered, we felt that was a very important dimension of the way that perhaps we work in the cultural sector, around empathy, being socially engaged. Connected, issues to do with transparency, communication, and sharing results. So if you haven't had a look at them, do please have a look. Hopefully they are a useful way of thinking about what we do and how we do it together. So this series of events, Principles in Practice, was really something, a way to explore, to unpack, if you like, what is in the principles. So as you can hear, in a sense, the principles are to some extent what's not to like. I mean, it's sort of obvious that you want them to be robust, and it's nice that they're people-centered and so on, but we know that doing those things, putting those principles into practice, can be a real challenge. So, especially when we're all firefighting, we have very limited resources, we have a lot of other pressures on for other stakeholders, our own feelings and biases, it can be really tough. So we wanted to kind of address the enactment and putting into practice of those principles through these events, hence this series. And the way that we've designed it, which is to say that we hope that it is a conversation. We hope that those of you who've taken part already feel like it has been a conversation. So although I'm so very, very grateful to 3 speakers that we have today, Sarah, Asha and Maya, who we're going to hear from in a moment, and you'll see that they are incredibly experienced and very expert in their fields. But we want to acknowledge that everybody here is expert in theirs, and that is all super useful, relevant experience for this conversation. So please, if you can, do stay with us into the second half, where we'll have a chance to talk with each other. I know some people have to dash off, but if you can stay, that'd be great. Just in case you have to dash off at the break, I will just mention that if you've enjoyed these series of events, tell us, please, of course, in those evaluation forms. But we hope also that you might be interested in the MOOC, the massive online open course that we'll be doing next year, I think coming out next autumn, going in more depth about some of these issues. And I should also say that we have also set up a new LinkedIn group as a cultural evaluators network, which was one of the suggestions that came from the co-creation group that originally worked on the principle. So that has now been set up and you can find it on LinkedIn. And I think it, like magic, that has just popped into the chat. So this third session, taking a creative approach. Now, some of you might have noticed that creative methods are not actually one of the principles that we included in those 12 principles. Really interestingly, it was one of the most contested subjects in our discussions, whether or not we should talk about creative approaches or creative methods as being an essential principle of cultural evaluation. I should perhaps define our terms. By creative methods or a creative approach, we thought perhaps there are 3 possible meanings. There may be more, and I'd be very interested to hear from you if you think there are other definitions. One perhaps is about inviting people to take part in creative activity as part of the evaluation process. The second, perhaps innovating with methods, mixed approaches, and or adapting totally new ones that are relevant to a particular situation, a particular form of learning and capturing value. And the third, perhaps, around co-creating with others what both the outcomes or the process of evaluation might be. So engaging other people through creative methods in determining what success looks like and so on. And it may well be a combination of the above. And I think you'll hear when we hear from our speakers that to some extent, there's a convergence of those 3 principles. So that's what we're taking a very loose definition then of a creative approach to be defined by all of us in this conversation. And I suppose that it's worth saying that one of the things that we talked about in advance of this session was how, in a sense, I've heard lots of conversations recently, people talking about, well, we've taken a very creative method approach, as though this were in some ways because it's fashionable and it's the thing you ought to do. And if you're a creative organisation, you ought to take creative approaches to evaluation. And I think we want to kind of challenge that question a little bit, to ask the question around, when are the tried and tested research methods not quite right or not enough? And is that always true? And if so, how do we go about doing it? So in the end, we came to the conclusion with our co-design group that creative methods were not a principle in themselves, but they were a means of achieving some of the principles that we had set out. So applicable in the sense that sometimes it's more interesting and more congruent with the cultural experience to use creative methods. So therefore, they're more engaging and they help us to be more useful. Rigorous, in as much as it might be the most suitable method to get to what we really want to get to. It might be about finding a language which is appropriate to the experience, because actually it's difficult to find, using one language to talk about another thing is difficult. And finally, open-minded and many-voiced, which were 2 of the really important principles again. So potentially there's more room to engage and involve a wide diversity of people where you're talking about creative methods, again, thinking about how you do that and perhaps applying creative thinking to how we do that. So you can see that this notion of creative methods is, in other words, shot through all of the principles. So in other words, that as with any method or as with any kind of evaluation method, purpose and context are all. And so without talking any more about that, I think it's time to leap into hearing from some of our speakers about how they actually work. So as I say, really, really grateful to the 3 of them for coming along and sharing their experience. They all have quite different perspectives. And I say great curatorial job ever at bringing together 3 people who come from very different places, but actually some quite interesting common ground I think you'll find between them. So what we're going to do is we're going to hear from 3 of them. We're going to have a panel discussion. Please do put your questions and comments and be ready to join in if you'd like to. And then we'll have a break at around about 3:30 before we come back to have a conversation among those of you who would like to stay and do that. And we would really encourage you to do that. And then we will finish at 4:30. So now to our speakers. Firstly, our first speaker is Sarah Boiling. I'm going to introduce her before I come on to introducing Asha and Maya afterwards. So Sarah, independent evaluator, among many, many other things. Are you standing by? Marvelous. Sarah, would you like to tell us a little bit about your views on creative methods and creative approaches?
Certainly am. I shall share my screen as I have some slides to kind of anchor what I'm saying. So bear with me for one moment as that seamlessly happens. Has that seamlessly happened?
Yes, that's perfect, Sarah.
Great. Okay, thank you. Thanks, Anne, for that introduction. And thank you so much for the Centre for Cultural Value for inviting me here today to speak at this event. I'm slightly daunted looking in the chat at who's in the room. So my God, what a great load of kind of minds and practitioners. So whew, no pressure. So I'm really going to kind of ground what I'm talking about in just a very real practical example, because I think Maya's going to talk from a maybe more academic perspective. Asha's going to bring another perspective. So this is quite down and dirty, what I'm talking about. So bear with me. So what I'm going to focus on is a program called Creative Civic Change, which we're just coming to the end of right now. And I'm going to talk about how creative methods are really embedded in that program. So there isn't time to tell you everything about the program, but I think the link will probably go into the chat about how you can find out more. But essentially, it's modelled on the Big Local program, which some of you might know, led by Local Trust. And it was funding to 15 communities around England to use arts and creativity to bring about social change in the place where they lived, absolutely rooted in those communities. We had an amazing kind of funding cohort that supported the programme. So Local Trust, Esme Fairbairn Foundation, Calouste Gulbenkian, and National Lottery Community Fund. So they all came together to put this, what they describe as an experimental funding programme in place. So two key principles of the programme were it needed to be resident-led. This wasn't about giving money to arts organisations to work with communities. It was giving money directly at grassroots community level for those people to make decisions about the sort of creative interventions they wanted to make their place a better place to live. So grassroots community led and creativity focused throughout as well. So two key principles in the programme. And these are 15 communities in difficult parts of the country where residents are really facing a lot of challenges around poor housing, poor health outcomes, limited employment opportunities, things like that. So creativity was already a principle of the programme. So as evaluators, we had to model that in our approach. So we've got an evaluation team of 3. So I'm just 1/3 of it. I just happen to be the one here talking to you today. But I'm joined by Noosh Hagdadi from Beat Freaks and Amanda Smethurst, and we work collectively on doing the evaluation. So I'm going to talk to you about three aspects. It's not telling you the entire evaluation story, but it's just picking out creative approaches. So I'm going to look at how we used it to set some outcomes at the start of the programme, how we use creative approach to gather data, and how we use creative approach to actually share our findings as well, which I know actually isn't strictly in the brief, but I just wanted to sneak that in because it feels like a useful thing to share. So setting outcomes. One of the delights of this programme was that it didn't have top-down funder-imposed outcomes. The 15 communities and the 15 projects could decide for themselves what outcomes they wanted to create in their places. So it was our job as evaluators to kind of support them to decide what that change was that they wanted to bring about. So we had a series of collective group workshops around the country with the different projects coming together. We did various things, introduced the idea of story of change, talked about creative methods generally, got to know the projects a bit more. But one of the key exercises we did that I want to share is this thing called What's the Scoop? And I suspect all of the things I'm probably going to share with you today are things that you are doing already. I don't think none of this, we haven't invented any of this. We've just kind of put it into practice, and I'm going to talk about it. So What's the Scoop was a way of working with the projects to go, okay, this is the world in which you are now. What world do you want to create at the end of the program? How will things be different when this program finishes? Create a newspaper headline for your local paper for now, which is in a way of showing what those challenges are, what that contextual background is, and then create another newspaper front page for what it's going to be like at the end. What will people be saying as a result of the work you've done? And I'm just going to share a couple here. This is the Blackwell Canary, Blackwell in Derbyshire. It's a group of kind of villages, all ex-mining communities. So you can see their before and after poster. The next two are just after posters. So the one on the left is from Creative West End in Morecambe, and the one on the right is from Philwood in Knoll West in Bristol. So the projects did this collectively, and they did it with, there were different projects in the same workshop, but so there would be like 5 or 6 people from one project, but also maybe 2 other projects as well. So they worked collectively within the project, and then they worked kind of with a big group as well. So there was a lot of interaction. So very straightforward way to imagine the future you want to create. And in our experience, also then a really good first step in going, okay, so if those are the changes, how will we know they've been achieved? What's that going to look like? Who will be affected? How will we know? What evidence do we need? So it was a great place to kind of start that next set of questions. So moving on to creative approaches to gathering data. Now, we rather crazily decide we wanted to try and use a creative approach to gather quantitative data. Creative approaches in qual, I think we're all doing relatively straightforward, but we wanted to see if it was possible to gather quantitative, standardized, systematic, large-scale data collection in a creative way. So at the end of the program, we needed to pull together the final impact report. As I've mentioned, the program was based on kind of flexibility and trust. So there wasn't a big reporting burden on these 15 communities. They did do reporting about how the money was spent, obviously, but nobody needed to count numbers. They didn't need to capture any demographics. It was a very kind of light touch reporting mechanism. However, at the end, we really needed to tell the joined up stories. We had lots of amazing separate stories, but we needed a kind of consistent picture. So we brought people together in a co-creation workshop to say, okay, how do we do this? We've got our 5 key outcome questions, because in those early stages, we did a lot of mapping across the different outcomes that the different communities wanted to achieve, and there was a lot of overlap. So we had 5 clear outcome questions already, which again, we tested out with everyone, and we tweaked and we adapted. So we had this workshop. Everyone came together for the day in Birmingham, and the winning idea from things like all kinds of ideas came up was this idea of a tree, which again is often used in consultation exercises, this idea of a kind of wishing tree, put your leaf on. But everyone thought that a tree might be a really good way to kind of capture data. We could have a question on each branch, and then all the leaves would correspond to the answers. Really straightforward. So we tweaked and tested this over a number of months about what was the best way to create it, who would make it, how can we make it sustainable. You can imagine that was quite complex. So we ended up with 3 elements of community creative tool. We did create a physical tree, which was a rubberized tree that was available, I'm afraid, to purchase on the internet at not very much money. We looked into every other possible alternatives, but that's the one we went for. But one of our places produced all of the leaves to hang on the tree. we produced a whole kind of guide about how to use community. We provided all of the leaves, all of the equipment that you needed, the boxes, the leaves. We did a video of like how to make it work, etc., etc. So loads of resource into this physical tree that then went out to the 15 communities to use in their place. But we also were aware that we needed some other things as well. So we did a paper questionnaire, usual story, but again, we just wanted to keep that kind of design theme of the tree going and have a more creative approach. So you can see that it is not, the questions look slightly different. It's taking that tree theme. So again, projects could download the PDF and print that off to use. And we had a Google form version as well, keeping that same design principle going through. So 3 different ways to collect data in a more creative way. So what happened? We got a reasonable amount of responses. I think we were pretty pleased. We got 800 responses from audience and participants who had experienced the programme in some way. We found that despite all of the enthusiasm, all of the co-creation, all of the support resources, physical tree was used much less. People reverted to the paper questionnaire and the Google form, paper questionnaire especially, which was interesting, and I can talk maybe about why that might have been. We also found that because the nature of this programme is all about creativity and adaptability and flexibility, projects did their own thing because that's what they were used to doing. So we had some tweaks to the questions, we had some tweaks to the method. So as all of you quant data people will acknowledge, then trying to put all of that data together was more challenging than it could have been. Because our whole principle was, this is a standardized, consistent set of questions, which means we can tell a collective story. So yes, so thoughts. Physical tree was a great idea, but actually setting it up was a bit too complex in terms of both setting it up as facilitating it. I think it's less complex as an audience member to do it, but the complication was in just getting your head around how it worked as somebody to stand by and help people do it. Also, this was the first time these groups of projects had been asked to do rigorous quant data collection. And so inevitably, it just wasn't the way the program worked. So it was hard. And also, we were working at arm's length with 15 different communities. It would have been great for the 3 of us to have the resource to stand by tree in 15 different places and do it. But we didn't have that resource. So we were in that situation of relying on colleagues to do it, you know, that whole kind of chain of other things. So an interesting process. Okay, final thing I just want to touch on briefly is presenting evidence as well. Because with a program with creativity as one of its principles, we thought it was quite important in how we shared things that felt kind of creative as well. So we produced a series of learning reports which were focused on different topics. And one, for example, was on community leadership. So one person from the project's lovely lady called Jane in Par Bay sat in a couple of our workshops, listened to what people were saying, and created a poem based on the content. And we then included the poem in the report. Just a different way of presenting information, really, that just softened it slightly. I've mentioned the final program-wide impact report that we're working on at the moment. And I would love to share with you the report version of that, but we're not launching it until the 13th of December. So I can't really, because that would be cheating. So what I've got here is my colleague Noosh's hand-drawn version. But if you can join us on the 13th, it would be great to kind of share with you the actual thing. So again, no surprise, we've used the tree motif as a way of presenting our evidence. We got a lot of feedback and support from the funders of this program about don't do another report, do something quick, simple and easy. So we've done a fold out poster with a tree on one side and some copy on the reverse, which I'd love to share with you when it's finally done. And finally, the most extreme version of creative evaluation is a creative response to some of the evaluation findings. So this has been produced by Heather Morrison, who some of you may know, who's an artist who was also one of the critical friends in Creative Civic Change. And based on some of the principles of the program, the how and why it worked, she's produced a series of, as you can see, visual interpretations of the principles. So that sort of creative sharing at its most creative in a way. So my final conclusions, speaking to your questions, Anne, at the beginning, I just think, as you said, context is all. Think about what is this creative method going to bring? Who is it for? Is it going to add something? Is it going to help with something? If so, yes, go for it. If not, don't do it just for creativity's sake, because it's hard. It's harder work. And I think that's worth saying. Yeah, it's not simple. It's more complex. The context is really important. Are your audiences ready? Are your stakeholders ready for what they might consider a softer approach to evaluation? You know, it needs to fit. Making things simple is actually very hard. Who knew? One of the advantages, I think, that's a really significant advantage for both the participants in the process and the sort of readers or the audiences, is it can speak to different ways that people either want to get information, want to share information, or how they experience the world. You know, so it's definitely kind of flexible in that sense, in terms of speaking to different kind of needs of individuals. For me, it also really fits with this sense of not treating participants in research as the kind of subjects, but actually it being a process where there's something in it for all parties. And this creative activity is in itself a pleasurable and a constructive and an interesting experience. So it moves away from that we're sucking information out of you kind of way of being, which we don't want. Facilitation and the right questions are still really important. You know, you need a kind of a guide for whatever process you're using, whatever approach you're using. You still need to think about, are these the right questions? How am I going to guide people to producing the things I need? And I think it probably does cost more, maybe. Definitely creative outputs cost more. I'm not sure whether creative approaches themselves cost more. I'd be interested to know what people think. So thank you. That was a whistle-stop tour through just one aspect, but I'd be really happy to kind of talk about other things if you've got questions from Anne.
Sarah, thank you so much. That was an incredibly clear, delightfully short route through what I know is a very complicated and many-avenued project. So brilliant. Now, I'm absolutely bursting questions I want to ask you about that. And I imagine that our listeners will, something I'm on the radio. I imagine everybody here would also be doing the same thing. So if you've got questions and thoughts that you'd like to put to Sarah now, please drop them in. But I'm going to move straight on to Asha so we can have a conversation all together with your permission, if that's okay. And we'll keep an eye on that. And Sarah will come back and have a conversation about some of those brilliant comments and thoughts that you just shared with us. Asha, are you there? So can I now introduce Asha Jail, who is an artist, a community developer, activist, and yoga teacher. And I believe he is yoga teaching at Leeds quite shortly after he's doing this session. So he's going to hop and skip after he's done this, because he's going to do that, one of his many personas, after he's finished doing this. Asha, can I give you the floor?
Thank you, Anne. And Emma for having me and inviting me to be here today. I've got slides as well. So just like Sarah's slides, apart from a little less beautiful, not as many pictures, but I'll share them with you nonetheless.
Yep, we can see that okay, Asha.
Great. So I'm not an expert evaluator like many of you are in the room. However, I did an internship after finishing my master's in evaluation, and evaluation is definitely one of the key skills which I have. I'm working as a freelancer, as a community developer across Yorkshire and the UK. It's definitely one of the things which I take a keen interest in. So that's why I'm here, and I'm going to try to stay focused and not go off on a tangent. But you may have picked up from Anne that I'm someone that does lots of things. People that do lots of things tend to go off on tangents because new ideas spark into their heads, but I'm going to try and stay focused. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about myself. I'll introduce myself a little bit further. I'm going to talk about the importance of contextualizing evaluation and research. I'm going to talk about ways of working and my practice with lots of examples or several examples of things which I've done. And then I'm going to reiterate from those examples the power of using a creative approach. And then I'm going to talk about building expertise into the community. I am where I am today with the skills I have because of some concerted efforts by specific practitioners to invest time, effort, and money to make me an action researcher first, actually, in both those roles, and then for the paid internship, which I mentioned. So there are ways of working which put expertise in the community. I think it's a very sustainable way of working. And then I'll talk about participatory action research and how it is not a performative act and what it should be and what it should not be. And that might elicit some interesting conversation and debate. And finally, I'll just offer a little summary, a quote, and maybe some reading for people to go away and do if they're very interested in what I've said. Okay, so about me. I'm a community developer. I'm an activist. I'm a yoga teacher. I disrupt the local yoga economy in Leeds with a small project called Free Yoga, where anyone can come and do yoga for free. I'm running off at 3:30 to go and teach yoga at Leeds University. I consider myself a peace builder, and part of this is slow activism. So I like to make social change very slowly. I've been able to do that this year through the World Reimagined, which has been a trail of giant, beautiful globes painted by different Black British, and Black Caribbean artists. Those globes and the artworks, the themes of those artworks discover or explore Black history, the many facets of Black history beyond the transatlantic trade and enslaved Africans. Alongside that trail, we have loads of rich conversations about that history. And that's why I consider peace building and slow activism. Also, I'm a creative practitioner. I play classical guitar and I write poems, which are inspired by West African cultural heritage. There's an instrument called the kora from West Africa. It's an African harp. It's a calabash or a pumpkin with 21 strings and a long neck. And I play music inspired from those 21 notes, which you can take from those strings. And I'm an activist. I used to be a very fast activist. I used to do lots of direct action when I was at university. I used to be very vocal and very confrontational in my activism. Now I'm a very slow activist. And I will actually argue that my practice in the evaluations which I've put together and as a researcher, I would say that is a form of activism that many people in this room could do too, if they wish. Maybe I'll win you over. Okay, so moving on, contextualizing evaluation and research methods. So the first thing to remember is that the development of research methods hasn't happened in a vacuum, and the world has been transformed over the past century through processes of decolonization, globalization, and neocolonialism. These processes are not linear, and consistency does lie in the fact that we have institutions which have developed and the perceived legitimacy to measure and evaluate our world has also developed and increased. And all those institutions are reflective of their respective times in history. For many, I'm going to throw this out there, that for many, this emphasis on colonialism may seem idealistic and lacking a professional realism, perhaps. However, for those whose life opportunities are determined by factors such as race, borders, and the end of empire, to discuss these topics not only feels very personal, but also feels existential. Not only are certain communities created by these politics, but they are held together by them, and they can also fall out because of them. So, ways of working. The ways of working in a decolonial practice doesn't just interest academics, it produces new locations of intellectualism. It returns expertise to the community. It creates new places where we can say knowledge exists. Through decolonization, the location of knowledge can be decentralized, and therefore it's an opportunity for researchers and evaluators to recreate political and cultural hegemony. So what is this in my practice? So ways of working in practice. The work of decolonization for me requires a toolkit, and for me that looks like creative approaches, and it also uses participatory action research. But I'll go on to talk a little bit more about these. Maybe it's worth saying now, it's on the tip of my tongue, that the word decolonization has many layers and meanings to different people, depending on where we are in the world. So for some cultures, decolonization is an independence movement which is promoting a cultural interest, perhaps over the interest of other cultures. However, in this country, we talk about decolonization, and it would be very far removed from that idea. We talk about cultural equity, or perhaps we're more concerned with concepts such as cultural appropriation or collective intellectual property rights. So now I'm going to move on to the power of the creative approach. My experiences as a practitioner and scholar means that I'm an advocate for creative approaches to evaluation and participatory action research methodologies. I propose a series of research methods and evaluative tools which centralize marginalized communities. And I have experience doing this with youth groups in the UK, groups of people from refugee and migrant backgrounds, marginalized agricultural communities in Ghana, and other marginalized groups in Malawi. One of my key inspirations in the work I do has been Augustus Boal and his Theatre of the Oppressed. The methodologies which I suggest, I believe, take more resources and time to conduct properly. Financially, I do think it does cost more money, because I believe it's essential to pay people that we make action researchers. I don't think that we can work alongside people and take a wage doing evaluation or research without giving them something for their time and effort too. Where was I? So I also believe that if done effectively, participatory action research can provide experiences which is empowering for the wider community, and it can break down the barrier which sustains participants in research as subjects to be researched. Instead of being subjects, they can become the agent of change, effectively through self-evaluation, which is really just saying what Sarah already said in her presentation. So creative approaches can allow for the participants to be the expert in a room, because they have pre-existing expertise in a medium of communication. Furthermore, using arts allows participants to express irony, semantics, and drama whilst conveying their thoughts and feelings towards their experience. Adopting creative approaches which are culturally significant to the participants will give them a sense of ownership. For instance, when working with a group of young people on a digital media project, we create a podcast series evaluating their project. They then had agency and confidence over the evaluation process because they had just spent 6 to 8 months, respectively, becoming podcast makers. And they became the experts in the room. They had the toolkit in their hands, and therefore they had ownership over the means of communication which we was using. It gave them a sense of confidence in entering that, and also an invested interest because they were using the skills which they were interested in developing and having opportunities to use. With another group of young people that I was working with using, we was discussing careers and life opportunities. I allowed them to write each other's CV based on the skills and behaviour they had seen each other exhibit throughout the project. The data gathered, I would believe, to have been more detailed and sentimental than what I could have gathered as an evaluator and leader on the project. It was an opportunity for them to express both kindness and praise for each other, and it was something they could take away with them and perhaps use in their own CVs, or perhaps to inspire their CVs. And I would say that that activity of getting young people to write each other's CVs was one of the most heartwarming ways of doing evaluation that I've ever known. And they say the most beautiful things about each other when given that opportunity in the space to do so. And a great toolkit for creative approaches to evaluation is Artwork's Creative Evaluation Toolkit, which is available online, and it's got lots of good references in. I've took them and I've tweaked them and I've made them more relevant and significant for whichever group I've been working with. But I'd say they're particularly good for working with young people who are learning what evaluation is and what role evaluation has to play in the project. But I think it's a great starting point. And another way of working which I've used is I've simply asked participants, how do you reflect in your life? Like, what skills do you have for reflecting on the world around you? And then I look at how I can use those approaches of reflection in an evaluation. So, for instance, I was working with a young woman, and she told me she found it easiest to convey her feelings through music. I asked her if she was never going to be able to attend this project again, but had to select 3 songs to remember it by, which songs would she choose? Her choices were both humorous and insightful, and they clearly expressed her love for the project. It was clear that when she explained her choice of songs, that the project was a place where she felt relaxed, a place where she could make jokes, and where she had a lot of meaningful friendships. So moving on to the next slide. I've already talked about the need to pay people in evaluation and research, particularly when people act as action researchers. I think that participatory action research requires collaborative approaches where evaluators work alongside artists and creatives, and those artists and creatives belong to the community which is under examination. Working alongside means that that person can be paid for their time and can have access to both the knowledge and process of evaluation. This means paying those participants to maintain a research aspect to their role within a group for a prolonged period of time. This empowers them financially, but it also allows them to gain a critical insight into the role of evaluation. Ultimately, this allows for the development of new skills which can have a lasting effect within their group and wider community. And this is how I first came to engage with evaluation, working on a project sponsored by the Arts and Humanities Research Council called Solidarity Hull, which was an offshoot of Refugee Youth. I was hired as an action researcher. Receiving a salary allowed me to explore research, explore evaluation, and it allowed me to then go on and find more opportunities working as an action researcher thereafter. So I think it's a really important way of building capacity into communities and community groups, is creating people job opportunities in the process of evaluation. And I'm sure I'm going to get asked about how do we protect bias in that situation. So come at me and I'll try my best. So participatory action research is not a performative act. Participatory action research will become defunct if we performatively claim it to be doing something without a clear understanding of our politicalization as practitioners and organizations. Because as I mentioned, research and evaluation has not developed in a vacuum. We have not come to have the careers that we have in a vacuum either. Being aware of the obstacles and privileges we have in our own life helps us to appreciate the meaning and context of the evaluations which we are offering. Ultimately, we reproduce meanings and value to the world according to our own privileges. I've already talked a little bit about decolonization and how that can mean very different things to very different people. So, for instance, in Indian nationalism, decolonization can represent this this belief in Indian culture being superior to other cultures, and therefore it reproduces hierarchy. So decolonization does not necessarily argue for the liberation of all cultures with some sort of equity, as we may associate it with subcultures in this country when people talk about cultural appropriation. So there's very different sorts of decolonization out there, and in the same way, participatory action research means very different things to very different people. I think that people doing jobs like mine, which were created largely in the early 2000s, and this wave of creative practitioners such as myself often approach participatory action research with just an endless process of community consultation, which is great. Community consultation is great, but it's not participatory action research. Looking at the work of people like Augustus Boal and Paulo Freire, we find that participatory action research can mean something much more critical and much more revolutionary. It can mean a cyclical process of encouraging participation, which develops actions and then creates a process of research and reflections based on those actions. That research creates a new audience and a new group of participation thereafter. And that cyclical process is participatory action research. As evaluators, I always believe that going into those groups, we have to be participants. I was working with a young group of people from refugee and migrant backgrounds who were using theatre for social change in a nutshell. We had an evaluator come in and we made them engage in our performance with us. We made them have a role in the performance and in the preparation of our performance too. They were slightly outside of their comfort zone, but it was healthy and it created a much better relationship between us and the evaluator. Finally, I wanted to talk about ethical storytelling, or finally on this slide at least, ethical storytelling requires that stories are owned by the protagonist. This is particularly when working with marginalized communities, where those stories can be very evocative, and it can hold people's trauma and the tragedies of people's lives within those stories. We need to be very respectful of how we handle and hold those stories. If they're expressed creatively, they cannot be reproduced, particularly as a piece of art for people to look at, without the consent and the ownership of the people and the protagonists within them. My notes. So one other point connected to this I wanted to raise is that I work a lot with young people. I'm not a youth worker, but I'm a youth coach. And I find that practitioners in youth services have at times had a tendency to overplay the hardship of the groups they work with in order to boost the credentials of the work that they've done. And the reason this is so dangerous is that this kind of research reproduces racial stereotypes, right? So people will often express that they've worked with the most violent or most poor or most marginalized communities as if this offers some kind of kudos to their career. But what it does in effect is it reproduces stereotypes of those young people and those communities. It's the unfortunate case that practitioners who are working in the third sector with these communities have found that the marginalization of the people they're working with is part of the commodity of their labor. So it's almost like I have to prove that the work I can do is working with these marginalized communities, and therefore it's almost in the interest of those freelancers or those workers to have worked with the most marginalized people. So to summarize, because I know I've probably talked really fast, and I just want to make sure that you've got loads to attack me with in the Q&A. Some of my key points, which I'm happy to take blows for. One, methodologies do not happen in a vacuum, do not develop in a vacuum, nor do researchers exist in a vacuum. We are all politicized due to our positionality in the world. Number two, creative approaches and participatory action research have the potential, or that word which I've written there, possibility, to relocate knowledge and power. Number three, creative approaches are meaningful to participants. And I don't want to underplay the stress on the word meaningful. Meaningful is essential to good evaluation. Number four, participatory action research builds expertise into the community. It creates opportunities for people to go on and do this work in the future. And number five, participatory action research should not be a performative act. And I just wanted to end with a quote by Bell Hooks, because I love quotes, amongst other things. And it's an amazing quote, of course. And I resonate with the sentiment of it. So it goes as such: I am located in the margin. I make a definite distinction between that marginality which is imposed by oppressive structures and that marginality one chooses as site of resistance, as location of radical openness and possibility. This site of resistance is continually formed in that segregated culture of opposition that is our critical response to domination. We come to this space through suffering and pain, through struggle. We know struggle to be that which pleasures, delights, and fulfills desire. We are transformed, individually, collectively, as we make radical creative space which affirms and sustains our subjectivity, which gives us a new location from which to articulate our sense of the world. And so that's everything. There's an email address for you there to send your much awaited criticism and debate. I love a debate and an argument. So if you have one, send one across to yogawithasha@gmail.com.
Don't worry, we're going to. Asha, that's just fantastic. Thank you so much for giving us a little view into your obviously very synaptic, full of connections world. That was really, really interesting and very different from Sarah's presentation, but actually rather interestingly and intriguingly for us, I think some really interesting common themes and threads emerging across the two. I'm going to resist the temptation to grab hold of them now and ask Maya to speak to us before we dive into that conversation. Asha, thank you so much. Maya, would you like to take the floor? So I just very quickly to say that actually you have a rather nice title, Maya, don't you? You are Postdoctoral Innovation Fellow, I believe, specialising in evaluation at the Guildhall School of Music and Drama. Thank you.
It always makes me feel like I'm in an episode of W1A. That
sounds so cool, though. It's more cool than W1A. Yeah.
Okay, I'll share my screen and slides. Hello, thank you very much for having me. Can you see that? Shall I minimise that? There we go. Great. Thank you for those fantastic presentations. So much similarity there, and so thank you for them. So yes, I'm a postdoctoral research fellow in the innovation department at Guildhall. What that means, apart from the W1A thing, is that I work a lot on their partnership and communities projects and their knowledge exchange projects at Guildhall. So yes, this fantastic quote by Baz Kershaw: "What are methods for but to ruin our experiments?" So as artists and evaluators, we believe that it's only by understanding the tensions and contradictions inherent in arts practice that we can better understand those moments that denote real and meaningful impact. So I want to share some of our work at Guildhall, which explores how evaluation methods might best support an understanding of the complexities and the messiness of our work with communities. So I'm going to share a few projects that we're working on. One of them has been written up into an article by myself and Dr. Toby Young from Guildhall that we can pop in the chat. And the second is a project that we're working on called Disrupt with Valentina Aru at Barbican, amongst other fantastic partners, which I'll talk about towards the end. So the urge to package our output and communicate it neatly, succinctly and compellingly is obviously really understandable given the current funding climate. But creative approaches, I feel, can support more traditional methods to tell a more complex, messy story of our work and to capture the nuanced stories of the benefits of projects for partners and participants. So perhaps most importantly, creative methods can be more accessible, which Asha raised a lot in his, for me, was, more accessible, more ownership given to people and communities, and can help participants feel and actually be more invested in the process of reflection surrounding their projects. So whether they're formal arts-based research frameworks, drawing tasks, poetry writing, video blogs, that fantastic tree example from Sarah, or most significant change stories, they challenge assumptions around what constitutes evidence of impact in the cultural sector. So arts-based research methods obviously have grown in popularity in lots of different disciplines, including health, psychology and education, not just socially engaged arts or arts, for their ability to effectively frame that complexity of the human lived experience. So here are some of the creative methods that we've been using at Guildhall and in my own practice. I should say I started off as I trained as an actor and started off as a practitioner, and I think that might be where my interest in creative methods have really come from. And what I think is really important is that they're embedded into the practice of the artist and can speak in a language that we as artists, practitioners and evaluators and participants can both understand and feel excited by. However, whilst evaluating artistic practice in these terms is often valued by arts organisations, project managers, participants, the sort of equivocacy and openness of these creative methods and approaches are still not always embraced or readily accepted in favour of statistical evidence. And as both Sarah and Asha talked about, they can be expensive and they are time consuming, meaning that whilst they might be initially welcomed and people might feel invested and excited by them, they're often deemed too difficult to organise or too time consuming. I've actually quoted for projects which involved them and then had to pull it out of the quote at a later date. And that is something that I think happens quite a lot. So this encapsulates a sort of broader struggle in the arts to provide mechanistic evidence based on replicable phenomena, methodological predictability and statistical significance. And despite a genuine desire, I think, on the part of arts organisations, funders and practitioners to conceptualise the benefits of their work, they create in more inventive and flexible ways. So one of the central challenges for evaluators on projects like these is to develop methodologies that are flexible enough to reveal those complex narratives of change without losing the rigour of more traditional approaches. And I've found that creative approaches also reveal those sort of subtle tensions and contradictions within a project that might not be revealed in other data collection methods. And they also potentially avoid that success-failure binary that's been so brilliantly captured through the recent Failspace project, which I'm sure a lot of you have been seen or been involved with already. So I just want to give some examples of this in practice and raise some questions. So this was a project I did for my postdoctoral research that worked with Barbican, and it was their national development programme, which worked with a number of different communities and arts organisations nationally. And it was about cultural democracy, cultural engagement. And this was a peer researcher task. We asked young people to go into their schools as peer researchers and ask a series of questions of their friends or peers and document where they consider their cultural home as a map or a picture. So this was one of those examples. There are also graffiti walls we've experimented with, free writing, songs, poetry, writing and blogs, digital creative methods. There's lots of digital stuff out there for those times when, as Asha says, oh no, it was Sarah's at arm's length evaluation, which is I'll come on to in a moment again. And how can you display your evaluation data creatively? Here's some examples of how you can do that. So some of these sort of questions that we're mulling over at Guildhall at the moment is how can we plan methods which allow the complexities of the work to be celebrated and not feared as failure? How can methods tell those more complex narratives of change? How can methods support those more sort of ambiguous spaces that we work in? And how can we maintain the rigor in analysis of creative methods through data triangulation or thematic analysis? So I'd like to talk about two projects quickly. One of them is an age-old project that I come back to all the time because I loved it. It's Unleashed, that was performed at the Barbican on their main stage in 2012. It was a massive cross-arts project that worked with Walter Mayahan and Boy Blue Entertainment and involved a cast of 152 young performers from different groups, be it poets, dancers, drummers. We ran an evaluation. We surveyed everybody, including the participants and the practitioners. We had massive focus groups and in-depth interviews with pretty much all of the participants that were transcribed and analysed. And the overwhelming response was extremely positive, as you can see by these this small quote and one of the stats from the surveys. However, what I wanted to do was get an idea of the kind of durational, how the project was experienced over the long term. So I went back 6 months later and ran a creative session where I asked people to document their experience of the project as a map, including valleys and craters, volcanoes, explosions, slow running rivers. And in this map, I asked them to write postcards home to their family, saying something that they're feeling about themselves, about their sense of self, about the project, anything that was kind of they were dwelling on at that point in the project. And it was only this creative session that revealed sort of potentially more complex experiences involved in the project that didn't come out in the evaluation earlier, that was just surveys. So in terms of rigor of analysis of this, these creative sessions, after they'd drawn the pictures individually, I asked for volunteers to narrate their maps and journeys back to the group. And these narrations were transcribed and then thematically analysed alongside the drawings and maps to avoid that sort of, we're asking them questions that we want to know and we're imagining their answers ourselves and reading into those maps. I asked them to narrate them. What the maps showed unanimously was this big volcano explosion. Everybody drew the same thing, even though they weren't sat near each other. And then a huge crater at the end, which you can see here by Upset that it's over. And that post-show lull that we all know happens, and how you deal with that with post-project support is really important. And this creative session really brought that home. It also showed that it was in those slower moments, that year-long devising process, that they had those real moments of experiencing ownership over their journey and change. And what we showed was initially those volcanoes looked like these amazing experiences, which of course they were, but also that they felt a loss of control during that time, that it was snowballing, that it was they lost their sense of ownership over the project. So this is where the creative research methods told us something that the other methods couldn't. Yes. And our next project I'd like to talk about is Disrupt, which is happening now, and which I'd like to invite you to our research work session on the 23rd of January that's hosted online from 6 till 7, entitled Liberating the Frustrated Evaluator, which was a fantastic quote by Dr. Sophie Hope, which I think she may be here. I hope we'll hear from her in the Q&A. And this is a chapter co-written by Valentina and myself. And in that session, we will have a Q&A with Sophie Henry from Birkbeck, Sarah Cassidy from the Old Fire Station, Oxford. I don't want to talk about their work too much because I didn't come up with these methods, but what I would like to do is just flag you to what they've been developing, and we'll put some links in the chat and you can come and hear from them yourself on the 23rd. So Disrupt is a toolkit that was co-written by Barbican, Guildhall, Royal Exchange Theatre, Jumped Up, Headway East in London and Slung Low. And it focused on breaking models of co-creating with communities to build more equitable partnerships. Working with elders, there was a chapter on working with elders, a chapter on young people, a chapter on co-creating with people living with brain injury. And then there was a chapter on disrupting models of governance. and a chapter on disrupting evaluation or co-creating evaluation methods. So this evaluation chapter explored methods that place cultural democracy at the heart of their process and included elements of co-creation, creativity and collaboration, where outputs are less defined and more relational and social. So the chapter shared approaches where everybody involved, including community groups and participants, can be invited to share their understanding of the context and the project outcomes. So yes, we interviewed Dr. Sophie Hope and Henry Mulhall from Birkbeck about their B-part evaluation, and Sarah Cassidy, head of inclusion from the Old Fire Station, Oxford, and Chris Rolls, head of training and development from 64 Million Artists. So first of all, I'd like to show you this storytelling methodology from Old Fire Station, Oxford, which is based on the most significant change method of evaluating. And it has six key phases that the Old Fire Station have developed. And I think it's really interesting in relation to what Asha said about participatory action research. So what they do is they recruit and train story collectors from within certain communities. They're paid. And I loved what he said about sustainability and building that expertise within communities, which I think is what this methodology does really well. They identify and brief the storytellers. So they'll be the participants from the projects who might be happy to share their stories. Storytellers and story collectors have a conversation. That conversation is recorded, transcribed and edited, and really crucially resent to those storytellers for final say over the content, to pull it if they're not happy with it, to edit it so that it really is belongs to them and reflects the conversation. They feel like it reflects the conversation. Then those stories are anonymized and a story discussion is held. That's this phase here, where participants, communities, arts organizations, funders can come around one table to share these stories and pull out common themes, common learning, and then that learning is shared. You can hear more about this on the 23rd if you'd like to come, and you'll hear from Sarah herself. So the other methods we have documented in the Disrupt Toolkit are part of the B-part evaluation. So Sophie's here, I think, so she can probably tell you more in the Q&A, but the B-part is a 4-year Creative Europe funded project developed by a network of 10 partners across Europe and Tunisia, who all share an interest in co-creation. So the evaluation of B-part was influenced by the social art mapping approach, a visual approach to representing and understanding relations, structures and connections within an organisation. And it was led by Dr. Sophie Hope and Henry Mulhall from Birkbeck. I find it really interesting what you were talking about arm's length evaluation, because these methods, if I understand correctly, Sophie, were partly, some of them were created as a sort of response to the fact that they couldn't be they couldn't over 4 years be in 10 different places across Europe and Tunisia. So they had to come up with creative methods that could be used by those organizations and communities independently of them. And they were cards on the table, which is, as you can see in this photo, a pack of playing cards. We'll put the link in the chat for Cards on the Table website. We're pack holders at Guildhall. There's pack holders at Barbican. There'll be pack holders in your areas, and you can actually either buy a pack or you can borrow a pack, I think. And it's a game you play that prompts different types of conversations. You're put together with other people to look at the project from the cards sort of tell you which way to look at the project. Their other methods are blind dates, where 2 people are put in an online room to have a conversation, and field note diaries, which I think is quite similar to Asha's description of participatory action research, where people go out and become the researchers themselves. So these methods were developed by Sophie and Henry's ongoing research. Sophie, who is the self-confessed frustrated evaluator, thank you, Sophie, for that fantastic quote, is interested in developing alternative critical approaches to evaluation, where the people become the evaluators of the project and have an ownership over that process. So just finally, implications for practice. How can we shift the culture around evaluation so that it's embraced as a creative practice? How can we maintain the rigor in analysis of creative methods? And when are they not appropriate? How can these methods complement more traditional social science methods? And how can we talk about impact in a language we all understand and, more importantly, can get excited about? Okay, thank you.
No, thank you, Maya. And what brilliant questions to end on. I'm not sure I managed to scribble them down quick enough. I'm going to have to go back and look at that. They're fantastic. Thank you so much. That was a really brilliant scoop up of also winding in some of the themes and things that Sarah and Asha were talking about. Fantastic. So can I please encourage, if you've got any questions, thoughts or comments, and indeed building upon what our three speakers have had to say, please do drop them in the chat or put your hand up. We'd love to hear from you. Meanwhile, though, I was just going to say that something really interesting that I think, bear of little brain that I am, I'm not sure that I have made this such a direct connection as you all have between, I think Asha was talking very much about these questions of power balance, and really the idea that actually there are no traditional methods for creating a power balance unless you go down a creative route. And it seemed to me that all the things that you were talking about, if you scratch the surface, were about finding ways of finding many voices, giving equitable spaces to people to have conversations, and that sort of was very inherently in so much of the things you were talking about. So yes, I didn't know really. Ash, I wanted to come back to you, partly because I know you might have to dash off in a minute, but before we necessarily finish. But I just wanted to ask you really about this idea. What you said it to us really, but why participatory action research? What's so important about that for creating the equal space? What are its attributes, and why does it make the difference?
A lot of organisations that I've worked in have spent a lot of time trying to make their spaces more accessible, and they do this by trying to translate flyers into 15 different languages or trying to write safe space policies, and those things are really important. However, I think if we have a space where people feel, yes, fundamentally safe in that space, but where they are given agency and expertise to have a voice, those other things you'll find change very quickly. And for instance, if you have lots of people from many different communities, you have the translators visiting that space. By creating participatory action research, we can create projects where more people will want to be in a space and contribute to creating that accessible and inclusive environment.
So it's partly about creating the appetite, partly about finding a common language, or rewriting the language that belongs to others in a way. And I was struck by what Sarah was saying. I think that the point of connection between what you were both talking about, Sarah, you talked about, treating, well, it's come up as a frequent theme about treating our evaluation subjects as kind of disposable subjects, things to be moved around to help us do our learning. And this notion that we aren't in some way learning together, that actually in some form we have to give back. And that might be quite a light touch way, just making it fun, or it might be a really profound way in terms of ownership and so on. And I don't know. And that seemed to me that all of you were interested through everything you were saying. It's actually these creative methods, ultimately the reason for choosing them is that they are about casting out the old hierarchies and finding a new equal space to have an equitable space to have a conversation in. I was struck how, I know it sounds, because that was what our last session was about, and I know it sounds silly, but I was struck by how profoundly, in a way, that was the underlying reason that you were suggesting using them. Would you agree with that, Maya? You just mentioned that I'm going to ask all of you this question about when wouldn't you, to help us understand that, when would you not choose to use the kind of creative methods you've talked about? You put that question to us, I'm putting it back to you, but please feel free to answer in the chat.
When you don't have time to do it, first and foremost, or when you're paying lip service to them because they're fashionable. You have to have the appetite, the interest, the investment. In the first instance, the artists and the participants have to want to do them. They have to be absolutely on board with them, and those conversations to really embed a creative practice, an evaluation creative method into their practice. You need to be talking to those artists right at the beginning before the project starts about how methods might be embedded in their work. So there has to be time and resources and possibly, as Sarah says, money. And in the toolkit, we do actually cost out a little bit some of those methods. So I call it toolkit for want of a better word, but it is costed out a little bit. So you can see a little bit about how much those methods might cost.
Yes, so that was something that you picked up on, Sarah, really about, again, you know, can you give it the time and effort that's required for what you want out of the process?
Yeah, I'm unmuted now. Yes, and I think for a kind of qualitative inquiry, it feels like the right thing to do. If you're really going to explore things in as much detail and, you know, in a way that, as Maya said, kind of values and connects with whatever you're evaluating is about, it seems like the right thing to do. I also think, though, again, half a mind on who's going to be looking at these outputs and what do they need to see as well, which is a bit of a depressing thought, but in a way, I think we do need to think about who the audience for the findings is going to be as well, and what do they need to, what are they going to listen to, what are they going to trust, what are they going to believe as well. So I think we need to bear that in mind.
Yes, actually, interestingly, I was doing something the other day, and somebody said, "Oh God, I hate it when you have to do something creative. I always feel so left out." You know, so I was wondering if there's a, you know, talking about bias, which I'd love to come on to as an idea. I wonder if there is a bias towards the let's call them creatively confident in any of your methods. Asha, what about you? It's absolutely embedded, and you know, for you it is about fairness and equitableness. But actually, is there something about the process that could be quite off-putting or scary?
Well, there's part of me which wants to say everybody is an artist, and I think there is truth that everybody can be creative, and a creative approach doesn't necessarily mean writing poems. It doesn't mean like producing podcasts or painting pictures per se. Conversations can be creative, and they can produce those answers which are emotional and talk about feelings and talk about the unquantifiable world of our inner world, of our inner humanity, our feelings and our love and our fears, and that can be captured through conversations. And I think anyone who can communicate in any way is an artist, because they can communicate with purpose and with meaning, and that becomes a piece of art.
Oh, that's really interesting, and it raises another question that I think we talked about in our conversations beforehand around the skills and attributes of the facilitator. It seems to me that actually another aspect that we may have skipped over is not so much about what you do, but how you do it. I don't know if any of you have a feeling that there are things about how the facilitator works in this environment, and whether or not that's just how you are or things that you can learn. Don't know, Maya or Sarah, any thoughts on that?
I'll jump in if that's okay. Yeah, I think facilitation is fundamentally, you know, you can't just give people a blank piece of paper and go, so tell us, how was it for you? You've got to kind of give them a structure and give them a guide and give them questions to kind of support them through whatever method you're using. And I think particularly when we're talking about impacts and outcomes on individuals, what I'm finding a lot, maybe because a lot of my work is now happening in that sort of cultural democracy, for want of a better word, space, is you need to be able to hold the emotional space for people in those kind of conversations. I think particularly in the last few years, when people are invited to talk about themselves and to share their feelings and what's changed for them, that can bring stuff to the surface, particularly if you're having conversations with people who aren't often invited to do that. So you need to be really, I think, mindful of the emotional implications of those spaces and be really careful and caring in your facilitation. Actually, I'd say that's a point that I'm increasingly aware of.
Yes, I was very struck, Maya, that you know, you were quite heavy on methods. What about the sort of the empathy, people skills around that?
So I was just going to jump in as well. I'd say, Sarah, I completely agree. So I work quite a lot with veterans that have experienced post-traumatic stress disorder or physical injury, and they're working on arts projects, and those projects are quite often about their experiences, and they can be extremely talk about opening Pandora's box. It's very sensitive. They're very sensitive projects, and my response to that as an evaluator is you are in it from the start. You make yourself look silly and you do the exercises. You're there from the beginning. You're a recognized face. You're fun. You're approachable. You're in the tea room. You're there the whole time. So you're not this person that's coming and observing. I mean, there is an element where you have to have that sort of impartiality, but I've found working in those communities, the best way to do it is to be present and join in. And then the rest comes naturally if you have the right people skills, I guess.
Yes, I was sort of struck by how all three of you talked about, you talked with a great deal of self-awareness about what you did and sort of vulnerability about your own practice, which seemed to me a really important, that the sort of less tangible parts of that kind of creative, that creative approach is about also your personal stance, which I thought was very strong in everything that all of you were talking about. One of the things I really, and again, not something that we talked about beforehand, but just I noticed that in a sense, all of you kind of implicitly made a case for there being something sympathetic in the aesthetics of the approach that you were taking, that these were things that were sympathetic to the process, they were sort of aesthetically congruent. I mean, how significant is that as a factor? Is it more about the people, or is it about the feel of the thing as well?
I would say people have come to be creative. That's why they're here. So the aesthetics really important for me. You're talking to them in the language they want to talk in. They didn't come to be involved in an arts project to complete a survey. They might have to complete a survey as well. But if you're able to find a way that communicates in the same language as the artists, or is really embedded, or the artist helps co-design those evaluation methods, then I just think they're more accessible, they're more interesting, people can get more excited about them. And I said in our pre-chat, and what's really important then, which we haven't really talked about at all, is then communicating back to participants the impact that their words have had on future iterations of projects. And that just never happens enough, I don't think. You have to share with them how what they've said has changed stuff, because otherwise they lose their sense of passion for it for future projects. They're like, oh, well, I said that, but nothing really happened. Nothing changed. I never heard from them again. So I think that's another really important element of the kind of cyclical process of reflection.
Yes, I mean, again, it comes back to sort of the theme that you've all picked up around sort of engage. These are more engaging ways of working, more involving, and I guess that's also about feeling that that what you've been part of has made an impact. Sarah, I noticed you really picked out. Actually, one of your reasons for choosing those methods was because it was congruent with the other things that the project was about. That it was to do with the look and feel of what you were trying to do.
Yes, absolutely. And storytelling as well became a key theme. And I didn't speak about that in the bits I shared with you, but using that kind of approach of inviting stories and sharing stories, and particularly I think in creative civic change, because what developed was a real sense of a cohort as well, and there was this sense of all of these communities are in this together. So those shared stories and them seeing reflections and overlaps and differences between their own stories and others in the group was really important. And we were really lucky because the stakeholders for that program were completely open to that approach. That's what they were happy to hear, things presented in that kind of way. So it, in a way, our struggles were kind of the opposite. Our struggles were with the systematic, robust, and the quant side. The creative storytelling side was a delight. And there's, my colleague Noosh actually says, quite often, we reached data saturation quite a while ago, I think, because there was a constant conversation and dialogue going on about what was changing, what people were learning, what difference it was making to them.
Yes, and I think that's there's some really interesting questions here in the chat about, well, coming on from some of those points actually there, Sarah. But I think so there's quite a complicated question from Sophie there, and one from Ben around funders and policymakers and how comfortable they are with creative methods. But really, both of them, just to open that up, because one of the things I really did want to ask you about ask you all about before it's time for us to have a break, is really around how do we have confidence in the use of those creative methods. I think you've all eloquently talked about why you might choose them, but how do you make sure they have the rigor to convince others? They might be engaging, they draw them in, but how do we know that they're robust? How do we know that they're not playing to our biases, our desire for those things to work, and so on? So can I ask you all, Asha, I'd particularly like to hear from you on bias. We said we'd talk about that. Can I hear from all of you about what your answer to that? How do you ensure that those processes are robust? Does bias even matter? Asha, do you want to come to that first, and then I'll come to the others?
I do think bias matters, and I do think that our work with creative evaluation, particularly if you are internal to a project, shouldn't sit alone. And I do think there should be external evaluation. It adds to the rigor of understanding of what that project was about. However, that doesn't mean that should be the only voice in the room as an external evaluator. And we should be very aware of the positionality of an external evaluator in producing whatever findings they find. Also, I guess in terms of being confident in using creative methods, what is essential for me and the community groups which I work with, because as mentioned, I work in the third sector, often with marginalised groups. What's essential is their confidence in engaging in evaluation. And rather than my confidence necessarily, like, I need to be able to perhaps put together a report of findings at the end. However, what I want to foster and encourage is the participant confidence in that process. And that also takes a process of selling evaluation, as I like to call it, which is teaching. Sometimes this is, well, under 24s very often, teaching them the importance of evaluation, teaching them where money comes from, teaching them about policymakers and funding, and teaching them how evaluation helps to sustain the projects which they're part of. Now, as I've told them all of that, they are obviously thinking, oh, well, we better say everything amazing about our project, we like our project. And so going through that process, I also need to tell them, actually, to get funding, we don't need to be an angelic project. We can have problems, we can have challenges, but we also need to discuss how we're addressing them. So we can show vulnerability to funders, that's fine too. And so that's what I'm doing when I'm selling evaluation to these groups I'm working with, particularly with young people, and doing youth-led evaluation.
Yeah, there is something about drawing everyone into the conversation about what you're trying to achieve, and that might be those policymakers and funders as well, mightn't it? Yes, Maya, what about you on robust and rigor? We talked about this quite a lot.
I'm trying to come up with an answer that could encapsulate all three of those really great questions. But I think there's something there. Like, I feel like there's something there around that analysis of the methods. I rely, when with any qual or any creative methods, I still try and rely on an element of quant, in the sense that through thematic analysis, if you do draw a map or you get them to draw a picture and then get them to narrate that picture back, you then have data that can be quantitatively analysed. You can use thematic analysis, whatever strand of thematic analysis or qualitative analysis that you use for that text can bring out some scientific rigor from what they're saying and some common themes that I think then potentially, coming on to Sophie's question, gives a kind of a more of a broader methodological framework for the work, instead of just chucking in a couple of creative approaches. And that's where you get the funder buy-in. I've had a really great conversation with someone from Nesta as part of a bit of research we were doing at Guildhall around how funders feel about creative methods. And he was really personally interested in them, but from a sort of funding perspective, he felt like the funders were loved the idea of them as an add-on to what is already existing. And I think that's where we're at the moment. But like I said the other day, you've got the pendulum and you need it to swing one way before it settles somewhere in the middle. And I think, you know, the more people who introduce these as add-ons to their evaluation, then hopefully they'll be seen in a more rigorous light by that sector.
Yeah, no, really interesting to hear that. And I was going to say, I think it feels, Ben might have something to say about this. It does feel as though, you know, there is more of a swing, you know, that people up there is much more interest and faith and confidence. I think we might be pushing it an open door. Sarah, any thoughts? For example, local trust, I mean, that work.
Well, yeah, that definitely is an open door. I think sampling is really important, just making sure that you are talking to as many people as possible, that you're triangulating across. If you can, exactly as Maya said, have different layers of different types of data that then you can go, okay, this is telling the same story. This isn't just some kind of single outlier who drew this in their thing. So I think if you can include creative methods with other methods as well, just so you've got enough data to really pull out the analysis in a believable way. And yeah, it was, as evaluators of creative civic change, we constantly talk about our position as being so close to the project and how, well, nobody can ever be objective, but how objective we can be. It's a constant tension. Actually, it's been a constant tension the whole time, but one we're just happy with.
I mean, I think you'll see earlier on in the chats, and I didn't pick it up quick enough, but Samira was, you know, sort of just reminded us all that the kind of the myth of having no bias, of course, is a very dangerous one in any case. And lots of some great input here from Jane Willis as well. Just thinking about how, again, that idea of tipping the balance. The more we do it, the more acceptable it becomes. And I think, Jane, you also had you're doing something soon, and you put a link in there for anyone who's interested in that. So, can I just say, brilliant input from everybody. So interesting, deep stuff. In a way, I want to be in a room with a much longer conversation. I'm afraid I'm not quite sure I've been able to do it justice today. Some point soon we must all get together in the same place, and then we can really get into this conversation. But to end this bit of the discussion before we have a break, can I ask you all for one piece of advice you'd like to share as a little sort of summing up of where we are, and in the least possible words you can do it. So I'm going to go in reverse order. Maya, one piece of advice to share with our colleagues.
Talk to artists and participants really early on before it starts, and ask them how they want to be reflective.
Fantastic, love it. Asha?
If we listen deep enough in the right locations, listening itself can be a radical act.
Listening can be a valuable act. I love it. Sarah?
I knew this question was coming, but I put it to the back of my head stupidly. Equity, respect, mutuality, just bear those things in mind the whole time in terms of what am I getting, what am I giving, and build a process that is absolutely as equitable as it can be.
That's lovely, because I heard that theme of give and gain all the way through what all three of you are saying, and that's great. I'm going to suggest now, but I just say thank you so much for everybody. I think I probably missed some good questions. Apologies in the chat, but if you can stay on, Maya and Sarah, I think, are both going to stay with us for some discussion after break. So it's now, and we're going to say goodbye to Asha, but if you're in Leeds, go to his yoga session. It's free, right? Meanwhile, thank you, Maya, Asha, Sarah, so much. Please go and have a break now. I'll just give you some instructions. If you can come back at 15:50, that would be great. And then we will give you some instructions to come and join in a conversation about what we've been talking about today, which would be amazing. If you can't make it, we're going to send you an evaluation form. Do please fill that out. But stay if you can. It's really great to have a chat. As I say, speakers, you've been amazing. Thank you so much. And hopefully see two of you in the next session.